Yeah, might as well get into
Oh,
it.
it's always the way. We always start like when we're ready, we kind of should be on here, like just using this. I don't know. I think I said right at the beginning when I pitched you, like we'll do these in an hour and we'll wrap it up.
You can't do a whole book in an hour. Like you see what the other podcasts do, and they're doing like two-parter episodes on a single book and stuff. So yeah, I think it's good that it's evolved into a 90-minute-ish sort of format. I think it worked out well. Uh, on that note, I don't know if you'll keep this in the edit. I assume you won't. A little snatch of behind the scenes producing magic on I've Never Read Discworld. In fact, you could almost say, extra, extra, read all
Extra
about it.
on the front page.
Hold the front page. Hold the front page. Hold the front page.
On the front page.
This month on I've Never Read Discworld. No, that's a movie trailer. That's not how newspaper people talk at all. And they start us off.
Okay, welcome to I've Never Read Discworld. I'm Andy Luke and I'm working my way through Discworld for the first time, guided by my amiable co-host, EJ Hart.
Indeed. So my second, at least, read through most of Discworld. This month we've reached book number.
25, according to the gorgeous cover I've got by Paul Kidby, which I'm gonna take a wee snapshot. I'll put it up on the video segment, which is on YouTube and Spotify, where we get up to all kinds of exciting hand waving movements. Watch out for those.
Yeah, I also trimmed my beard, which may be of interest to video viewers or not, as the case may be. Certainly not worthy of a front page headline, I wouldn't imagine. So yes, book 25, which is The Truth, a personal favorite of mine. I think this is definitely at least my third or fourth reading of it. And I blazed through it, read it really, really quickly by my standards, which I used to read books really fast. Now I don't because I've got like kids. That's who I blame, certainly. Anyway, I read like 5 pages at night and then I fall asleep. But I got through this one quite quickly. I did some sneaky daytime reading at work, which I don't often do. And yeah, it was just a delight. Great to be back. And I'm going to talk a little bit, maybe as we go, about where I see this book in my personal kind of reading of this world. But before we get into that, I'm really keen to hear a little bit more about the book itself, Andy. Some publication details, maybe the blurb. What do you think?
Yeah. I suspect nobody's forgotten the truth, but we'll do it the technical way. As far as I have here is publication details Doubleday, 1999. According to the back cover, William just wants to get at the truth. Unfortunately, everyone else wants to get at William, and it's only the third edition. William de Worde is the accidental editor of the Discworld's first newspaper. Now he must cope with the traditional perils of a journalist's life, people who want him dead, a recovering vampire with a suicidal fascination for flash photography, some more people who want him dead in a different way, and worst of all, the man who keeps bugging him to publish pictures of his humorously shaped potatoes.
That's a mouthful, that one, which is apt, I suppose.
It
So,
comes with some very high class journalistic quotes like James Delingpole, the Telegraph, the Times, very fancy. Um, yeah, I
well,
love this book as well.
yeah, I mean, they're all falling over themselves. Journalists obviously love nothing more than to read a book about what a important institution the press is, I'm sure. But that said, they're all also absolutely right. It's a cracking read, and I'm further interested to hear your initial first impressions of it.
Yeah,
Now,
so
now that I've spoiled mine.
this is kind of a novel kind of drives into my driveway, raps on my door, comes in and sort of makes itself at home. It really entwined into a lot of my life stuff and was going over kind of stuff that I knew already and I loved it. So I trained as a journalist at college. I did my work experience. I graduated into self-publishing newsletters. with actual news and reviews in them, writing for lots of magazines. Journalism and self-publisher is like right through my bloodstream. So this was just, and it kind of has been since I was a nipper.
Yeah.
So
Where'd you do your work experience?
the Bangor Spectator,
Oh, is it still going?
I believe it is.
Awesome.
Yeah, the Northdown Spectator at a time when Colin Bateman was the assistant editor, Colin Bateman of Divorcing Jack,
No way.
novels, lovely bloke.
Tremendous writer as well.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Wow, that's excellent. Yeah, I also had a brief dalliance with journalism as a teenager. I wish I could remember the name. There was this charity down the centre of Belfast that was essentially kids news, where if you were a teen, you could go and volunteer, and we used to get a page in the Times because it was like a national charity, so we had a page in the Times like once a month or something like that, and we'd occasionally get stories in the local papers too. I remember I did one. I only worked on a couple, um, but I did one that you wouldn't get away with now, where as kids we pretended to be in wheelchairs. So we got wheelchairs and we wheeled around Belfast city centre to try to figure out how accessible or inaccessible it was. And I don't think you would get away with doing that now. But they published it in the Irish News, I think, or possibly the Belfast Telegraph. Um, yeah, gosh, I wish I could remember what that charity was called. I remember, I know that Lyra McKee had been involved in it when she was younger as well. He's a local journalist who was unfortunately murdered. Um, so it sort of came back on my radar around that time. Really, really great thing for kids to get involved in. I don't know. Hopefully, it's still going because the truth is kind of a slippery thing these days. A much more slippery thing than it was then. Certainly, a much more slippery thing than it was at the time that Terry was writing this book. But at the same time, his usual sense of kind of premonition of seeing the way the wind was blowing socially when it comes to these kind of institutions was very, very much on point in this book, wasn't it?
Yeah, historically, what the truth does is it goes back in time to that time when the journalist was like a bobby walking their beat, and they collected stuff. The word is always with his notebook, pulling that out, and that was the way it used to be done. You had to have a certain sensibility in order to go out and collect stories, and you had to uh, proactively engage with people and talk to them. Um, and even like in the internet age, that's not such a difficult thing because you can do that remotely. You can email interview questions and that, but it has also moved. There's also been a greater move to the Ankh-Morpork Inquirer type of thing, where that sort of outlandish, surreal, and even violent news has replaced the traditional journalistic methods of investigation, research, documentation. All the honorable, noble ways of doing things have just been um, overridden with cutbacks on technology and staffing and yeah, so much more in terms of challenge.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can just see like it's very much of its time, I guess, kicking and screaming towards the end of the century of the fruit bat, which I think we all know means the 20th century. But at the same time, Terry was an early adopter of all things kind of internet and all things technology. And as much as you can kind of see the influence of tabloid journalism, especially British UK tabloid journalism in this book, things like the Fortean Times, early kind of really out there kind of, I hesitate to even say news sources, but those kind of conspiracy kind of publications that made that sort of leap, I guess, from like copy shop newsletters to the early internet and then exploded in popularity from there. Terry would have been very much across that and very much aware of it. And you can draw a line from there to kind of where we are now, and I guess essentially a post-truth world. I mean, I feel like we're jumping the gun a little bit. We're getting into the dissection of what it means and all that, because this is a world that we're both extremely familiar with and we've got a lot to say about it. But there's also a really, really good story here and some really well developed new characters
Yeah.
for Discworld as well.
I'm just remembering now that Terry did some newspaper work himself prior
He
to
certainly
this
did,
one.
yeah.
I'm wondering, was that a journalistic thing or just a contribution of
No, he was a working journalist for a while. Yeah, I was just thinking about this when we just before we came on air, because I it's now been a little while since I finished reading Rob's biography, so the details, the fine detail of Terry's life has slipped away probably, but he was a bit of a poacher turned gamekeeper in a certain sense, that he worked for a couple of different newspapers and then sort of switched sides to be corporate PR for the energy, something in the energy sector. So he sort of saw both sides of it that way, I think, and then certainly dragged every kind of drop of his experience into this book, and it's authentic in a way, that no other Discworld book is, and that's not to say that other Discworld books are inauthentic. They're not. They're really well researched and really, really well observed in terms of the human condition. But I think there is just a little extra secret sauce in this one because of Terry's lived experience as a journalist.
Yeah, I think seeing it from both sides is certainly an extra insight as to just experience in one part of the industry. It's something I've had a wee dalliance with myself very recently, where I'm kind of been on the receiving end of the press and having to move about rather quickly to sort of uh, navigate being in that position. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it really just sort of go back to, I mean, my work as a comics journalist was pretty much just at the cusp of home internet. So
Mm.
a lot of what I was doing was like getting comics, underground comics through mail order, and then like publishing like a review sheet where I would list like the addresses where other people could send off for other publications. I would give a quick arts review, an address, and a price. So it was very much, it feels a lot like what the word is doing and how he's having the Ankh-Morpork Times distributed around. It's low tech enough to still fit quite well into the day to day of Ankh-Morpork.
Yeah, for sure. I think, that you say it's kind of low tech, and it's low tech by our standards, but we're really seeing a concerted effort by Terry to drag the Discworld kicking and screaming into the century of the fruit bat, as he so often says. We've got the clacks. We saw the introduction of the clacks in the Fifth Elephant, and now we're seeing the introduction of moving type. It's an interesting order to introduce those technologies, but they kind of work in sync in this book a little bit. But the what I'm hesitating slightly because of spoilers, or trying to perpetually avoid spoilers for Andy. But they were very much in the phase of the overarching Discworld story, which generally fans refer to as the Industrial Revolution of Discworld. So I don't think it's a spoiler to say that at all. As I said, the clacks have already been introduced. The moving type is now introduced. We're in a world that has newspapers. We're in a world that has the telegraph for all essential purposes. That puts us, in terms of round world, probably puts us somewhere in where the 19th century, I guess, early 19th century. Yeah, so like literally the Industrial Revolution, in terms of technology. So that's super fun, to take that and to throw in trolls and to throw in vampires and everything we've learned about Discworld and magic and how it operates over the previous 24 books is exciting. I found this really quite revelatory. Reading it for the first time round, pretty much. I think not as it was released. I think I might have caught this book a couple of years later, but yeah, I mean it really dragged me back in. You know. Now I've been part of why I've been sort of waffling and pontificating so much before we get into the story is because we really do have some I've never read Discworld breaking news, hot off the press, which is that for the first time in now over 2 years, I have written the synopses.
Yes, yes, exciting stuff. Um,
They are so bad. And Andy had the fantastic idea, genuinely very good idea, of writing them in the style of either headlines or newspaper copy. And it was such a good idea that he made me do it and he did and ruin it.
I
So
literally just scanned them before coming on the air, and they look great.
they're awful. They're genuinely awful. And as a result of you forcing me to do it, I'm gonna make you read the first one.
Well, okay. Rumor in city. Dwarfs turn lead into gold. Son of Lord de Worde struck by printing press. Ankh-Morpork Times prints first edition. Humorous vegetables. Patrician arrested after oblong office brawl. Watch. Flummoxed.
I actually forgot. I left the humorous vegetables one in as a placeholder. It's like I need to come up with a, or need to look in the book to see if they had a good headline for the humorous vegetables. I just left in humorous vegetables.
The humorous
Fantastic.
vegetables thing is surprisingly well pulled throughout the book. I should have written it down, but there's one line near the end which is like, okay, this is like a big payoff from. There's like a punchline regarding the humorous vegetables. That's just
Indeed.
phenomenal.
Yeah, I was quite heartened to hear that the humorous festivals made an appearance on the blurb on the back of the book. That's some good stuff. It's huge. You cannot escape as a Discworld fan. You cannot escape the humorous festivals. If you go on the Discworld subreddit, where I unfortunately lose far too many hours of my life, people will regularly cross post pictures of humorous vegetables that they find on other websites or on other subreddits. They'll just post them without context to the Discworld subreddit, and everybody immediately gets it. Everybody immediately understands why that's been done, and the mods completely allow it. You know, it's got very little connection to the series as a whole. It's absolutely verges into inappropriate content, but it's now such a bedrock of the fandom that there's no stopping it. You know? So if you've got a good picture of a humorous vegetable, go to reddit.com/r/Discworld and post it there. I think we have a tag for it. I think we've got a flair for such posts. You can search the subreddit just for humorous vegetables if that's your thing. So yeah, I wonder is this I don't recall a specific reference to it in the biography, but I wonder is this something that Terry encountered as a journalist? you know.
Before we get into the word, I mentioned reading. I mentioned the last pod, like having read the first 10 pages of this, and that the watch is in it very early on. And I
Mm.
think this book does a really interesting job of doing that kind of view from the gallery kind of thing. It's a watch story in a sense, but it's seen from a completely different cast of characters, and I really like that aspect of this book.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about yeah, like you said, this first 10 pages and not being colon appear, and this is a story where the patrician is accused of, well, he's accused of murder. He doesn't actually murder anybody, but he's framed and usurped essentially, and everything we know about Discworld up to this point would make this a Sam Vimes or a City Watch story. So to introduce a completely new conceit, a new strand into the series to cover this kind of story is a big swing, and I mean he absolutely nails it, and he has his reasons for doing it. But you could totally imagine a companion novel which focuses on the watch telling exactly the same story, and it would probably be awesome, you know.
Yeah. What I've had a wee problem with some of the watch stuff in that it's the mystery is a bit overly complex, and you have to be very sort of on everything to have a crack at unveiling it. This is the Columbo entry. It just shows you how everything's done, and you've just to fill in the blanks as the characters do.
Yeah, that's true. It's a slight shift in genre. I suppose it's not a police story. It's literally all the president's men in many respects. Like it lifts plot beats from real life, from the Watergate scandal, and puts them in this story. So yeah, it's tonally a little bit different. It means that the onus isn't necessarily on solving the mystery; it's on exposing the people behind the mystery or telling the truth about the mystery. Uncovering the truth rather than punishing the perpetrator. So yeah, it's a nice kind of change of pace, and it means that you don't need quite as many twists and turns for it to feel satisfying to the reader. You can kind of focus on the stakes for the city and for our characters as well. So yeah, it's a good one. I mean, there's such a melting pot of pop cultural references to make this story. They're worth kind of unpicking a little bit here at the start, I think, especially because my synopsis is so truncated, to say the least. You've got the whole kind of man in the iron mask thing going on. The patrician's got a doppelganger. The plot involves replacing the real patrician with this doppelganger and then having him deposed. So yeah. I mean, even sort of saying it out loud makes the plot seem a little bit overly complicated.
There's quite a lot of ideas early on. I was talking to my brother Gavin, who kickstarted this whole journey we're on. And he described it as a kind of a cine noir kind of book.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I mean, certainly those Oliver Stone references, are really clear. There's also bizarrely quite a few Pulp Fiction references. I don't know if you would consider Pulp Fiction a neo noir as such. I would argue that it could be considered that way. So yeah, for sure, I would absolutely agree with that assessment. We know Terry's into that stuff. The Discworld Noir is a video game that he was involved in creating, and why not? That the whole bringing the journalist into that genre kind of keeps the reader on their toes. They're not necessarily in the world of Marlowe or even of Polanski of neo noir. So even though you get to touch on that genre and play with some of the tropes, you're not locked into telling it in that way if you don't want to, because he's drawn from all these other kind of influences as well. I mean, even as I say, like old school, literature stuff like Dumas. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting place to start the story. The whole like dwarfs turn lead into gold thing it's an odd starting point, but I guess as a journalist, like I get where he's coming from, like the idea of just how revolutionary I suppose the moving type is. Like I think that it's really important to drive that home at the start, that this was world changing technology.
Yeah, it fits in very well with the last book dedicated the first 10 or 15 pages to Clax.
Yeah.
We've had it before with moving pictures. Um, I find myself doing a bit of talk about character. I find myself doing a bit of head casting early on in the book, which
Interesting.
pretty much stood well.
What are we thinking?
William de Worde as the actor who plays the newspaper editor in Deadwood. Um,
Oh yeah, oh
I,
gosh,
I
it's been
think
so long
that de
since I watched
Worde is
that.
supposed to be quite a bit younger.
Wow, man, Deadwood, that is taking me back. It's
Yeah,
oh yeah, yeah, Jeffrey Jones. Yeah, because he's a little bit, and like it's interesting that the idea that William is a bit posh, I think, is interesting, and it's not just window dressing. It's touched on a couple of times in the book, and I thought it was great. You mentioned moving pictures there. I thought Terry did a really good job of just dressing the table early on. After Williams printed his first edition, and he's dragged in to see the patrician because he's created this world changing. Well, he didn't create the world changing technology, but he utilized it in a way that is going to be disruptive for the city. And the patrician acknowledges straight away, like, yes, we've had this before. We had moving picture technology, and demons nearly invaded the world. We had the soul music with Roxanne, similar thing. The world nearly ended again.
Yeah, I think it played. There's a bit of a play for laughs with the wizards, and oh, it's the dungeon dimensions again, is it?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I think it's really important and really clever by Terry to just get that out of the way because he does want to do something different. So in the early Discworld books, when some technology from, or not even technology, I guess when some cultural aspect of our world leaked into the Discworld, it was treated as such. It was treated as an invasion from a different dimension and a kind of potentially apocalyptic threat. Whereas now the Discworld is just moving at its own pace. It's now just modernizing in a way that is safe and natural and based in reality. It's not the dungeon dimensions or whatever. It's like we have clacks, we have moving type. It's not mystical, it's not magical, it's not leaking in from anywhere else. This is just, we've just figured out how to do it and we're going to do it.
It's as if the dungeon dimensions are disempowered by their presence.
Yeah, and that's for the best. Anybody who's kind of stuck with us the whole way through will know that I'm a little bit impatient with that stuff. I find it a little bit one-dimensional because this is the kind of stuff that I prefer. Like I want to see this stuff emerge in the context of the society of the Discworld and of Ankh-Morpork, and to see the stories that could be wrung from that, because they can have a lasting impact on the world and on the characters. Because this is now established as like a really well realized story world where we've got characters who are previously main characters in other series who are playing supporting roles in this. This feels like a really distinct, living, breathing world at this point. So to see it evolve from a technological point of view and the cultural ramifications of that's so exciting. The first time you read this, you're like, right, this series is, I think, it's taking the step up to another level. Is that your feeling? Like, do you feel that there's a shift here potentially within these last two books in terms of the series, or?
Yeah, yeah, pretty much so. It's a bit of a blunt answer,
I
but
mean, yeah, like that's the right answer. Certainly. I mean, I sort of remember, might as well mention it now, I suppose. Getting a little bit burned out on Discworld, probably around the time that this book came out, around the around the year 2000 maybe. But then coming back to this, definitely didn't buy it when it came out. Don't have the hardback. I owned the paperback of it for sure. So I probably got it 2002 or 2003, around the time I was entering my last year at school, and just being blown away by it as a result of just feeling like, as I had sort of slightly matured in those couple of years, that Discworld had matured as well, And I read this and the book that came after it, Thief of Time, pretty much back to back, and was just completely blown away by them. I was sucked back in after whatever, a year or maybe a year and a half away from reading Discworld. And yeah, everything that happens in this first section was kind of enough, I think, to convince me. I didn't take much more convincing than this, that the Discworld was literally going to move with the times, and it feels like a slightly different place than it did maybe even in Carpe Jugulum. As much as I like the vampire stuff in Carpe Jugulum, and I could see that he was trying to make the Discworld a bit more grounded and a bit more modern. He was doing that through politics, which I wasn't quite as interested in, whereas I was a little bit interested in journalism as a teenager. So this kind of excited me a little bit more.
the word is kind of yeah, he's already a journalist when we meet him. It's just a very different type of private journalist, but he absolutely sees uh, from the moment the printing press hits him, or maybe shortly after, the advantage in this new technology. It's kind of like there's an epiphany sort of level of realization going on. It doesn't hit him all at once. It actually happens over a period of a number of days or weeks, and I appreciated that it's something that he just found himself coming into.
I feel like I set this challenge quite high by not including by basically leaving out plot points that I couldn't think of good headlines for. There's massive gaps in these synopses. So just thinking about Pin and Tulip, they're introduced quite early. They enter the city in this first section with gosh, I haven't even included the guy's name with the doppelganger.
Oh, I've forgotten his name. Pin and Tulip, I have head cast as Rick Mail and Iad Edmondson, uh, particularly from a 1980s shock horror comedy that got cancelled called Hardwick House, where they guest starred in an episode as to very Pin and Tulip like characters.
Yeah, you can kind of see it. I mean, the physical. I mean, I assume Rick is Pin and Aid is Tulip. Is that the kind of?
Yeah, that's the kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
thing.
Rick is too tall and Aid is potentially too skinny, but the energy is bang on.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They're really well constructed.
yeah. Fantastic. Yeah, it's interesting, looking at L space and stuff like that, and people kind of drawing different comparisons as to who these characters are based on, and obviously with the overt references to Pulp Fiction elsewhere in the book. John Travolta and Samuel L. Jackson, their characters obviously come up. People talk about the old firm characters from Gaiman's Neverwhere, which we're not going to talk about. Um, but just like the Cray twins, I guess, is another one that comes up. I think Terry, when he spoke about it, was just quite clear that like this is just an archetype that exists. You have two ne'er-do-wells, one of them smart, one of them stupid, and that assists you as a literary device because it means that the smart one always has to explain the plot to the stupid one. And the stupid one can do something stupid if you've written yourself into a corner that will get you out of that corner. So yeah, it's one of those things where I think you can kind of overanalyze it, but I definitely agree with Terry that it's a useful trope. And it's one where where he's not, as you mentioned already, he's not as concerned with the twists and turns and red herrings and mysteries this time around. So to just have these guys going about their business and kind of narrating it to us, that's great. We actually, as the readers, should be ahead of William in the plot in this because the kind of tension comes from us kind of going, oh, is he going to figure it out in time? Is he going to be able to expose the plot? That works best if we already sort of know a bit more about the plot. By that, I mean the plot to depose the patrician, not just the plot of the book. So yeah, so having that kind of classic setup between Pin and Tulip really works. It sort of helps streamline things from that point of view. Just the whole drugs thing, I don't know. So I'd love to know where that came from. I haven't seen much chat about that. Just the idea that he'll just take absolutely anything.
Yeah, yeah, that was interesting. I wondered if we had maybe seen Tulip and Pin before because they are a very they feel like top tier Discworld or Ankh-Morpork, certainly rogue villains. There's an absolute savagery to them.
Yeah, I think there's because I again not having not done any deep research on this, just kind of reading what Terry's been quoted as saying about it on Elspace already, that he sort of mentions that dynamic between villains that I just said, the smart one, the stupid one, explaining the plot to each other. He also mentions the kind of the triumvirate, I guess, of bad guys where you've got the boss, the skinny one, the skinny conniving one, and the fat stupid one, which is pretty much exactly what the setup was in Hogfather. So
Yeah.
yeah, I sort of felt there were similarities there, I guess, where those are two books where we spent more time maybe than others with the criminal element who are involved. Um, and how he characterizes them in each of those books is it's distinct, but it's not super distinct. Like he does write criminals in a certain way, but it's in quite a pleasing way. It's in a way that draws us in. We don't empathize with them necessarily, but we enjoy spending time with them. They have really interesting quirks. They're really vividly drawn. They have their own wants. and needs and flaws. And yeah, you don't need to reinvent the wheel necessarily, but it's worth spending time fleshing those characters out if you want to make the story sort of feel cohesive. And yeah, the one thing I would say that I don't love is the whole fake swearing thing. I guess I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, and I talked to Gavin about this morning. He much the same filled in the blanks with his F or whatever. Um, and then you get the reveal, I think, through Sakura Misa later in the book, where why does he keep saying ing? Uh,
Yeah, and it's a funny enough throwaway gag, but yeah, it does. It makes you sort of because I'm the same. I'm reading the full word every time I read it, and then you're going, oh, he's not actually saying that, and then it does for the sake of a gag. It's a good gag, and it's a good recurring gag. Like he gets a bit of juice out of it, but I don't know. Yeah, it's one of those ones. It's a big swing, but look, at the end of the day, it's one of those things you can only do in prose, and Terry is a master of that. I think deploying jokes that wouldn't necessarily work as well in other mediums, and this is kind of one of them, I suppose. So partly is it's maybe jealousy that I can't write as well. So I don't know, but yeah, doesn't throw me as much this time around. I remember it being one of the very very few quibbles I had with it the first time I read it.
um, we get there's a couple other printing press characters. There's Good Mountain, who I think throughout the book does a relatively quite good job as a sort of like a minor or supporting character, I think. And Sakaramissa
It's just
is it
Saccharissa, isn't it? Or maybe
from
I'm reading it wrong. Saccharissa, is that it?
Sakarissa. It was only when Gavin again asked me how to pronounce that, and I said I hadn't a clue because
Yeah, Saccharissa.
this
Apparently, Saccharissa Cripslock doesn't exactly roll off the tongue.
no.
Uh, Typical Pratchett fashion. Um, yeah, so I guess the other big kind of issue of the day, both in terms of the book and in terms of the actual day today on which we record this, is this business of racism and of minorities and of um, cultural integration in a metropolis. So the fact that something that's been touched on before, this idea of racism, speciesism, or whatever, speciesism as an analog for racism, I guess. It's been brought up in Discworld before. So the fact that we have, I guess, these characters who are coded as minorities, i.e., dwarfs, they're the ones who bring the printing press to Ankh-Morpork. It's not an invention of humans of Ankh-Morpork. It's been invented by a minority species from outside. And in terms of this context, like the reason that the committee to unelected patrician exists, like their main gripe is that the city has become too multicultural. There are too many minorities in the city. So the fact that the printing press has been brought there by one of these minorities, and then that's ultimately going to result in the undoing of the plot to unelected patrician is important, obviously, and it's a very very conscious choice.
Yeah, this is quite right to highlight this. It's right the way through the book, and it's a major plot motivator, but it's never kind of overtaking it. I think I maybe have one or two of my favorite quotes focus on that, but yeah, these issues of migration and class as well in Saccharissa and Williams variation.
Yeah, yeah, I thought it was great that wasn't shied away from.
Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah, and also, the kind of development that he's done over the last few books on things like dwarf culture and actually on vampire culture as well. He's got a real bit between his teeth about vampires at the moment. These last few books, and you can tell he's really quite found his groove with all the Uberwald stuff. So to take that development and now bring it back to the cultural melting pot that he's created in Ankh-Morpork is really interesting. And what we learn about Good Mountain's reasons for wanting to make gold, for wanting to make money out of the printing press is quite sweet. We touch on that later on.
That's it. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I'm gonna say this as if I've discovered it, but I haven't. You know, I love all the references, all the really nerdy kind of references to the history of printing, and Good Mountain is obviously a translation of Gutenberg, the Gutenberg press.
Oh,
Again, I just read that on Elspace. I didn't do any special research or anything to discover that. There's a few other nerdy references to fonts and stuff like that in the names of the dwarves.
oh,
So if you're into that kind of thing, you probably already know. You probably know more than we do. But just the attention to detail in this book, as in every Discworld book, is absolutely top notch.
there's a couple of really interesting things going on in terms of the migration and the bigotries and how the characters are like lenses to examine that through. So with William, he has been in Ankh-Morpork or somewhere nearby for most of his life, and he's been raised with these prejudices that are sort of ingrained and not particularly. I mean, he's quite different from his father in that way, but they're not sort of the kind of soft prejudices. Would that be? Uh,
Yeah, on
yeah,
yeah, and any kind of biases. Yeah, so I think he's very clearly trying to work against his conscious biases, but then sort of Saccharissa maybe pulls him up later on that he also has certain, actually maybe Otto does too, that he has these certain unconscious biases, you know, in the context of how those conversations have maybe moved on in the intervening
yeah. The
25, 26 years, that feels pretty prescient, you know.
the flip side of that is our villains, Tulip and Pin, who are strangers in Ankh-Morpork and are kind of overwhelmed with the vampires, the werewolves, the various types of um, being that lives in Ankh-Morpork, and all of Ankh-Morpork's weird idiosyncrasies, like Assassin's Guild and Thieves Guild, and they're kind of taking that all in, and not particularly discriminating or prejudiced outside of the usual violence.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's quite an interesting choice on Terry's part, where like it's a good introduction if you're picking this up as your first Discworld book, because this has, you know, this is a standalone book for all intents and purposes at this point. So you could pick it up and without knowing anything about Ankh-Morpork or about the Discworld. So it's good to have that POV of these characters who are coming here for the first time and they're like, God, what the hell is this? But I think it also kind of serves as quite a good reminder for readers who have now read 24 Discworld books and have kind of started to take the world building for granted. Just to remind us that, like, this would be weird, you know, this setup is not necessarily normal. There are characters in this world who are still going to be kind of on the back foot when they encounter it. So yeah, I think because you can get into this kind of easy rhythm where like, yes, the Thieves Guild will give you a receipt. Yes, the assassins will only kill somebody if they have a contract, but you can still find new and interesting ways to use that world building in the stories. And Terry's just a master of that, you know.
That's a very nice segue into talking about the one character we haven't talked about, which is Waffles, who returns for the first time since Sorcery, which is book 5, which was
Mm.
so this would have been your first introduction to Waffles.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And I don't remember thinking it weird that just like the patrician suddenly had a dog or something like that. I mean, I only, even now, only vaguely remember him being in Sorcery after reading it for the podcast. So yeah, it's an interesting one. And it's very not very, but yeah, it is a little bit surprising. I think that it's taken this long for Terry to decide to utilize that as a kind of plot point that the patrician is humanized in that way that he has his dog, he has his little save the cat moment where there's an animal that he cares about and that serves to humanize him. There's definitely opportunities to wring character and story from that, and here we are 20 books later. It's happening. It's finally happening. And Waffles is now extremely old and decrepit as a result of
Right.
that.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm not sure how convincing it is when we told about Waffles' overwhelming smell. But yeah, this is sometime after sorcery, so old age allowing for that stink. Yeah, that's
I have
fine. Old
I have a
dog.
s it just occurred to me, and write in if I'm wrong, please do. There's a bit of a plot hole there potentially
Oh,
because there's a time jump during Weird Sisters, right?
oh, this is a 13-year thing, isn't it?
Is it only 13 years or is it longer? I think it's longer.
5 or yeah.
It's not like 18 years
Hmm.
because it's like it's
I do remember we spent a bit of that podcast trying to figure stuff out. Yeah.
yeah, the time jump stuff. So if Waffles is in sorcery, which predates Weird Sisters, and then there's an 18-year time jump, that's how many years is that in dog years, right?
Quite a few, yeah, I would imagine.
Yeah. So I mean, it's okay. It's fantasy world, and it's the patrician, so he's maybe got ways and means of keeping his beloved dog alive for, you know, 20 plus years.
I'm sure Leonard of Quirm has some answers.
That's it. Yeah, maybe that's why Leonard was brought in the first place. Maybe there's a backstory there.
There's that
Uh,
extra strong coffee he was brewing in the previous book.
yeah,
It links in.
indeed, indeed. So, in the interest of expediency, I'll crack on with the second batch of headlines, shall I? Part two. Times hires city's first vampire photographer. Guild of Engravers launch rival tabloid. Paper stolen from Piss Harry, no charges filed. City's biggest cake mix-up. This, this is ridiculous. It doesn't make sense at all. But yes, we get the introduction of Otto. We get the introduction of the Inquirer. The city's biggest cake mix-up is a real headline from the book, the context of which I've completely forgotten.
Yeah, this was where there was a bunch of flour escaped from a truck and a bunch of milk escaped from a truck and various other cake ingredients.
Eggs, I assume, would have to be involved, so I can't remember. Otherwise, it's not a cake. So yeah. So again with the
Oh, yeah.
continuation of bringing those kind of more horror themed Ubervaldian kind of characters, keeping them very much front and center. That seems to have been an ongoing theme of late. With Angua, with Igor. Now we've got Otto, and this slightly more kind of horror tinge to the Discworld oeuvre. It sort of feels like it's bled in over the last kind of 4 or 5 books or so, maybe. I like it. I was a fan of that stuff. We've talked about it before. I loved all the Anne Rice stuff and everything when I was a kid, and I think I was first a bit resistant to it because I sort of felt it was kind of it was taking the piss maybe a little bit, but nobody takes the piss better than Terry Pratchett. You got to embrace it.
Well,
Got to
not
get on
and
board.
there's quite a bit of suspicion around him, and the sense that he's going to betray them. He's going to get up to some dark arts stuff. And I was really glad that they didn't go that route with that character and give us somebody who's like fairly honest and well-meaning and well, honesty with a bit of there's a bit of in there too with the dwarfs and the use of the psychedelic worms.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean he's definitely meddling with stuff he shouldn't be, but
yeah, it's
yeah,
a great character. The whole stuff about the will you join me at the mission? I feel
yeah.
sing along now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I ever fully believed that he was going to fall off the wagon because we've sort of been there already in the previous book with the Countess who, was set up as she was going to be this villain, and then it turned out she was teetotal vampire, and a similar kind of character arc going on for Otto, except that we actually kind of we walk Otto right up to the brink, which I had sort of forgotten about actually, since my first or second read, where like the dwarves have to hold him back, like they literally have to physically restrain him because he's exposed to blood, and they sing the songs stuff. And I thought that was actually quite funny. That whole sequence totally worth it. It doesn't happen till later on, but yeah, I quite like Otto as a character, and he does sort of serve as a bit of a foil for William's prejudices as well. And he has a couple of frank conversations throughout, and it's a really good way of just getting through some of the technological innovations that would have to happen for a newspaper to be possible in Discworld, because so much world building has already been done in terms of like how cameras work with imps and so forth. So the idea of imps painting with acid onto a plate that is then engraved, I thought was brilliant, absolutely fantastic. And then having the three imps with the different colored goggles to print in to paint in three color again, just being able to take his ideas to the logical conclusions. I just admire that so much.
Yeah.
I mention it time and time again, but it never ceases to amaze me how he's able to do that, and how complicated but real the world then feels as a result.
Absolutely. The Ankh-Morpork Inquirer, you've already mentioned the National Enquirer upon which it's based in the Fortean Times, and this dovetails very nicely with, I guess, the sorcery era Discworld, where these mad, unusual things, they're very much more commonplace. So, yeah. So you've got the odd, surreal fantasy world of Discworld dovetailing into the industrialized, technical Discworld seamlessly.
Actually,
Not
yeah,
even a dovetail, like they're intermeshed, really.
it hadn't occurred to me for even a second until just now that any of those stories in the Inquirer could be true. But on the Discworld, they absolutely could have been true, but we know they weren't. And it's interesting that, yeah, perhaps as a result of that, he's had to go out of his way a couple of times to point out that like William or Saccharissa have investigated the same stories, and they have like the more mundane answer, because actually these things as reported in the Inquirer could be true in the context of Discworld, because all this mad stuff has already happened in previous books, as you mentioned. And maybe, it's giving the people of the disc, and of Ankh-Morpork in particular, the benefit of the doubt, a really, really big benefit of the doubt, by saying, oh, that's why they believe it. That's why these things are so readily believed, because they're actually entirely possible. But we know there are people in our world who will believe the Fortean Times and will believe the National Enquirer and believe Fox News and all the rest of it. So yeah, but I actually had really considered that angle where like, yeah, elves really do kidnap people's husbands in Discworld. Like that's a thing that is actually pretty plausible at the end of the day. And we also get the first introduction of Harry King.
Ah, first introduction. Interesting. A character I was really impressed with, that quite long scene. Um, yeah, again, seems like another archetype of the sort of the city entrepreneur from humble beginnings, a story already written. Um, but yeah, it convinced me quite well. The interaction between Good Mountain Deward and Harry
Mhm.
had all kinds of power and class elements to it. Yeah, it made for a really interesting interaction.
Yeah, I this is probably the scene that most vividly stuck out in my mind from the very, very first time I read it, which was, yeah, the meeting between William Goodmountain and Harry King, where he's talking about, can't remember the word he has for it, for the penny that he finds in the muck, basically, and he's got a specific word for it, and he's surprised that William knows this word, even though he's an aristocrat, essentially. He's got soft hands. He's never done a day's hard graft in his life. But William's obsessed with language. And that's his power, is that he knows words and he knows how to use words. I don't know, something about it always just reminded me of this time out of absolutely nowhere. So I went to school in St. Malachy's, Carlisle Circus in North Belfast, which is used to be quite a rough area, still isn't great. And it used to be the shop across the road from the school that sold, single cigarettes for 25p and stuff like that. I just remember being in the shop one day. It was probably around the time this book came out in 1999 or 2000. And the woman, Mary, who owned the shop, just out of nowhere from behind the counter, just told me that I had book smarts, but no street smarts. She just said, see you. Those were his exact words. She said, see you. You've got book smarts, but you've no street smarts. And I don't know if she was just eavesdropping in my conversation. I don't know what I would have been talking about. But I just remember she just came out of nowhere and just told me that. And I was like, shit, man. This is me. I'm William de Worde in this scenario. That's who I am. I'm the guy who likes the words. I'm not the guy who had to learn them the hard way. I'm the guy who learned those words from books. And that, I mean, she was right. She had my number. Like she had me nailed for sure. But something about the first time I read the scene just reminded me of that. I was like, oh man, yep, that's the guy that I am. This is the character probably in Discworld that I can relate to the most. And probably you must feel similarly, perhaps, with your background. I don't know.
No, actually, because I came at it from the other way. I mean, I was fairly smart at school, but it was until I was about in my late 20s where I was really working hard at sort of the academic stuff.
Mm,
Up until that point, I did a lot of manual jobs. I helped maybe about 10. I worked in retail. I did a lot of retail actually.
yeah, same. But that was
Gardening,
that.
um, lot butchering.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so. Yeah, I kind of came at things the other way, and I guess that's why the story of Harry or that sort of manual worker made good as that sort of romantic appeal for me.
Yeah, for sure. I'd like to point out that I was called out on this before. I think I had a chance to enter the workforce. I think it would have been 15 at the time, thereabouts, maybe 14. Uh, when this assessment of my character was made, but I've put in many a day hard graft since, I can assure you. Uh, yeah, but yeah, that's a great scene. As I say, it's one of those Discworld scenes that I is really kind of crystal clear in my mind after all these years from first reading it. And yeah, just blows me away how well constructed the world is. The world building, just I know I bang on about it all the time, but like the world building is just so good. And the reason it's so good is because it's based on character, right? Like Harry King is a person. He's a character that we all sort of vaguely recognize, even if we don't get a one-to-one analog of it. Like that's a person that we can understand. And building the world around characters, not just around things, not around made-up elven languages or talking trees. No shade on Tolkien or whatever, but building it around recognizable characters, like that's what makes Discworld special to me. And I think Harry King is a great example of that.
I think actually it was this moment in the scene in Harry King's yard when I thought to myself that the Discworld stuff, the Ankh-Morpork stuff, would have made a great TV series in the sort of 1970s, 1980s mold of Minder or The Professionals, whereas it's just shot in a regular kind of city, and it's grimy and it's shitty, and it just seems like a perfect fit, with junkyards and scrapyards and stuff.
Yeah, very much you can sort of see that kind of mid 20th century London is
Aesthetic.
all it's all over the story, isn't it? You know, just the kind of the feel of it, the texture of those old TV shows that you mentioned. Uh, in this story in particular is really there in the foreground. I think it's a really good point, really good observation.
I just want to mention the stool pigeons, quite literally stool,
Yeah,
Fowler Ron's gang. Um, and there's actually, we have seen gas boats specifically. That the talking dog is actually named as Gasboat for the first time in this book. Um, it's that's never been.
other characters finally acknowledge him as yeah, he's got his, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because we know who he is, but the other characters are now kind of catching up after that first initial appearance. It sort of feels that now that he's been in two books in a row, which has obviously not happened before, he's a much more solidified presence in the
Yeah,
city.
there's previously been sort of that general kind of miasma of that sort of group and their kind of sensory manifestations.
Yeah, or yeah, you know, the rumors of a talking dog have been dropped here or there in other books, and we get the sense that yes, the decision to keep him alive after moving pictures wasn't the first choice, and it's sort of taken this long to go. Well, okay, we're actually going to put him in the A plots of some books. You know, two books in a row. We're going to put him front and center in the A plot. This is a character that has got quite a lot of comedic potential. 'Cause I mean, he's very much the kind of comic relief in Fifth Elephant and in this book, but in a way that absolutely is essential to the plot in both stories as well. And to have Gaspo of all characters, you know, involved in a Watergate kind of conspiracy. You know, the fact that his character originates in the Hollywood version of Discworld, and now he gets to play the part of Deep Throat in the Discworld's version of All the President's Men is like it's just nailed on. It's brilliant, you know, like to have that character on the shelf, to just be able to lift him off and insert him so smoothly into that story is just brilliant. Yeah, the fact that Harry lets him keep the paper or take the paper, it's the whole point of that scene. We didn't really get to the whole point of it, that you know, he's kind of on their side, like that kind of, that's interesting. Yeah.
Investment there, isn't there? I don't think it's all of it, but it's very much implied that if William covers Harry's daughter's wedding,
Mhm, mhm,
then
mhm.
that will be a part of it, and also like Harry getting to stick it to is it Mr. Carney is behind the Inquirer?
That's right. Yeah, the head of the Engravers Guild. Yeah, so like yeah, the power dynamics and like the publicity, like what the value of publicity, I guess, is something that maybe, you know, because Terry was on both sides of that. He was a journalist and a publicist. You know, that idea that you can trade the favor of publicity for a tangible thing like a pallet of paper is obviously something that he would have been very aware of, and to bring those kind of dynamics into the disc world is really interesting.
And we can
Uh,
believe Harry's a powerful enough figure that that's action. What he does is not going to turn around and bite him in the ass. Um,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean he's powerful enough that he can wear that for sure. But what's important to him in that moment is the perception of status, or his, you know, for his wife in particular, you know, and for his daughter, I guess, that he's willing to trade that potential hit to his business in order to make them happy. It's quite sweet. Really humanizes him and keeps the stakes. You know, something that, yes, there's this whole conspiracy going on, whatever, but like there are also the other main stakes in the story is the Times going to survive? You know, the Guild of Engravers want them gone, so there's that's arguably the A plot, and the conspiracy is potentially arguably the B plot, because William, I mean, they obviously intersect and intertwine um, really well. But ultimately, William's the main character of the book, and what's important to him is the Times. You know, So
Yeah.
to have all this stuff going on alongside the conspiracy just really helps keep the stakes up, really helps kind of ground that with our main characters, and gets to introduce us to cool new characters like Harry King as well. Oh,
Veterinary's missing dog could crack the case, says anonymous source known as Deep Bone. Reward offered. Suspicious nuns kidnap suspect dogs. Guild heads meet to elect new patrician. Scrope tips for oblong office. Scent grenade incapacitates watch werewolf. Inquirer's top writer joins Times. Burglary at the Word Townhouse.
so yeah, get your bingo card ready. It's the traditional Discworld third act where everything happens. There's a
Kaboom.
lot going on.
Yep.
Where to begin?
Oh, so we've already talked about Deep Bone a bit.
A bit, and Waffles too, to be fair.
We've got yes, Sister Tulip, um, and Brother Pin
Yeah.
paying a visit to the offices of the Times.
Yeah, nothing like good old fashioned British drag, villains in drag, heroes in drag, and all the kind of traditional tomfoolery that comes with that. Tulip in particular, obviously the jokes write themselves in that. But I think, the political aspect, and actually something we haven't really talked about at all, is, William's encounters with the watch, his encounters with Vimes in particular, and even just like the reframing of Vimes as a secondary character in a new character's book is quite a brave kind of step to take. This, as we mentioned right at the start, this is a story in which a pretty high level crime occurs in Ankh-Morpork, and we would expect that to be a City Watch book. So to kind of see Vimes through William's eyes and to see the watch through the eyes of a different protagonist is really quite interesting. I know we've had a couple of times, we've had Nobby and Colon kind of pop up as like a little bit of a kind of, Statler and Waldorf kind of, running commentary on other events. But this is the first time we've really had Vimes playing second fiddle in somebody else's book to this extent. And it all kind of comes to a head to a certain, well, it comes to a head a bit here.
Initially, it was a bit, yeah, like because the word begins with quite different opinions of Vimes and than I have. Um, Quite anti-watch sort of character and not in a throwaway manner. It's something that the word kind of sustains through the books, although that does grow and change. Um,
Yeah, I think there's a mutual, not maybe, no, it's probably not a mutual respect, but I think William has a grudging respect for Vimes almost from the start, but he's also keenly aware that, and it's almost like instinctual because obviously there's no frame of reference for this within the Discworld because newspaper journalism has literally just been invented. But William has this instinctual sense that he shouldn't be running things by Vimes before he publishes them, for example, that there is an inherent tension between the journalist's job and the policeman's job, but that is right and just, that isn't a problem. That's how society should function. He instinctually sort of feels that way. And I think by the end, Vimes kind of comes to respect that, which is interesting. In a Vimes POV book, I feel that would have took quite a long journey for Vimes to get there. And probably that journey does happen. It just sort of happens off screen, as it were, because this isn't Vimes's book. It's William's
it
book.
does say quite an interesting parallel between the two, the old school copper and the old school journalist. But as you say, they do kind of weave in and out of understandings of each other to get to a point much greater than where they were when they began.
Yeah, for sure. And we're getting really, really into the political intrigue in this section, and I'm glad it's not massively over-egged, but yeah, getting Gasboat involved as Deep Bone is funny for sure. And this whole idea that the aristocrats are going to essentially put a useful idiot in the oblong office, I think is insanely prescient considering where we're at with modern politics. That you've got a bunch of racists who just want an idiot who they can control in power, and you just kind of you just open up the news and
I
you go,
quite
right, okay.
a severe reading of Scrope as that. I mean, first off, it's very interesting that while a lot of this book has a patrician and his dilemma at the center, that he's very hardly in it and wields no power. But I saw Scrope's role as somebody who's a lot more easily controlled. Probably isn't going to do anything like what Veterinary has instituted.
Yeah, well, I think when they're having their meetings, the meetings of the committee to elect the patrician, I think it's implied heavily, certainly, that it's the word who kind of says that, like, yeah, Veterinary's done good things, but he's gone too far. Those are the words that are used. He's gone too far. He's let in too many of these other species. We need somebody who will listen to our advice, basically.
And
You know.
Scrope seems to me very much a sort of a stand-in guy. He will do as he's told. He won't make any waves. Um, and not that that's essentially a negative thing. It's just not an active thing. That was my read of it.
Yeah, and it's a valid reading of it for sure. I think it's hard not to take a more cynical reading potentially in the current political climate if you're that way inclined. But that wasn't necessarily the intention when it was written in the late 90s. The world maybe wasn't in quite as dire straits at that point. But yeah, the idea of essentially a
The
patsy.
politicians that we had in those days, they were pre-Trump era. Essentially, you've got a lot of pre-Obama era, maybe, but a lot of cookie cutter stuff. Tony Blair, whose government did an awful lot of great things in Britain. It's essentially a cookie cutter of conservative politicians.
Well,
Uh,
yeah, I mean, to bring it back to publicity, it was a rebranding. I mean, it was probably one of the biggest political rebrandings in Western political history. Like, and the concept of New Labour, like that was publicity. That was, Terry would have recognized that for what it was as a publicist himself.
you had second George Bush, who was pretty much the same as the first, if I'm
Yeah, well,
not.
I guess this book would have been written in the Clinton era, and he had his own sort of reputation, and was covering up various things, obviously using kind of his image and using publicity as well. But I think that in the late 90s, this idea of kind of useful idiots or puppet kind of figureheads of governments is a concept that would have existed, but it's not one that we would have thought that we would have been applying to the West. We would have seen these kind of things happening various countries after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but now it's come home to roost. Now we've had Johnson, we've had Trump twice. Now we're the ones having to live under these guys. These puppets who are having their strings pulled elsewhere, and just you're just seeing it play out in real time in America right now as we record. You're seeing the split kind of in the MAGA movement between the puppets who are controlled by Russia, who are obviously kind of against America bombing Iran, and the puppets who are controlled by Israel, who are obviously in favor of that. And I don't mean that in any kind of grand conspiracy anti-Semitic way. I just mean that in the literal sense that Mossad obviously have stuff on certain American politicians. They're obviously being influenced, whether it's through PAC money or whether it's through intelligence agencies. Like that's something that's clearly happening. So, yeah, so we're witnessing this in real time. in a way that we probably wouldn't have thought possible in the late 90s, or the way that hopefully, I'm sure, even though Terry had a cynical streak, I don't know if he ever would have seen it coming to this.
We get the word manages to outwit the watch werewolf Nobby.
Yeah, yeah, Nobby in inverted commas. That's a great, yeah, it's a great mystery, and
The commitment to that joke is fantastic.
yeah, and it does make sense to a degree if you everything we've learned about him over the previous 24 books. You go, yep. Every single joke about him is about him not being quite human, about him people not really being sure what his species is. This is a tremendous payoff for that. It's a joke that's been brewing for a long, long time since Guards. Yeah, tremendous stuff. And again, just quite a good idea. You know, like if you're writing a story, if you've created a world in which there's a werewolf police officer, like again, once again, you take that to its natural conclusion. How would you deal with that if you were a criminal?
Mm.
You know, so yeah, the idea of the scent grenade or the scent bomb or whatever is really inspired. And I would not go off on it because we don't have time. But just because you touched on it a little bit already, you know, all these little elements, things like the scent grenade, things like Harry King in his yard, as you mentioned, you know, they're really visual callbacks to shows like Minder and stuff. You just go, oh, I can totally get why they wanted to make a police procedural set in this world.
We get that whole scene where the word goes and he buys all the chemicals.
Yeah, like
That
you
bomb,
can
and yeah, it's what
you can just
call it,
see
like
that
a
you can just see
visual
that
kinetic language going
yeah,
on.
you can just see that scene playing in an episode of a CSI Ankh-Morpork, which is what Terry envisioned, you know, and we will talk about it, the watch, at some stage after you've read Night Watch. But you can totally see the potential for the series that Terry had in his mind when you read sequences like this, I guess, you know. Um, but yeah, this section sort of takes us up to about the 300-page mark, which is where it's got a really good act turn actually, where Saccharissa goes to borrow a dress from the de Worde townhouse, and that's where she realizes that that's where Pin and Tulip have been concealing the doppelganger, and then things start to really kind of escalate and come to a head. And even though it's like, yes, obviously there's going to be a bit of a damsel in distress situation here, you know, she kind of holds her own, and we'll get to that in the next section. Yeah, it's interesting that at the start, when the patrician is kind of hanging a lantern on the fact that this is quite a similar premise to moving pictures and soul music, he straight up asks William, "Is Dibbler involved in this?" And William's like, "What? The hot dog guy? No, obviously not."
Yeah, it's such a delightful reveal.
Yeah, and then
It's a kind of oh of course moment.
yeah, and then when they not it doesn't become a massive plot point, but I think it's telling then that they kind of use his skills for good, or they try to use his skills for good by making him the ad sales guy. I've got a feeling that Terry must have a specific person in mind, thinking that like to work in newspaper ad sales, you have to be a Dibbler kind of personality. Like he must know somebody, or he must have worked with somebody who had that mentality to kind of draw that connection. But yeah, the Dibbler version of of the you can kind of see that if Dibbler had been involved from day one, like why veterinary would have been concerned for sure. There was something else I was going to quickly mention, just because we were talking about the bad guys in Hogfather earlier as well. The the black light that Otto uses, you know, to take these photos that tell the truth. You know, this the slightly horror, almost Lovecraftian element that occasionally creeps into Discworld books. You know, and it's on display here in these dark light photos. And we have the character Pin, who then becomes haunted by that, and he starts to feel his past indiscretions bearing down on him in a way that I think we started to sort of see with the gang in Hogfather as well. I always find that quite interesting that when he has these really well realized antagonists, these quite ruthless characters, that he still feels a need to kind of drag their conscience out of them to a certain degree. It doesn't like the idea that these bad people are just bad people, that either they have to confront it head on and that they have to feel some kind of consequence for it. I think it's obviously something that's important to him.
Yeah, the supernatural element with the criminals in Hogfather seems like a much more part of the story kind of thing. Whereas here, I hadn't actually made the link with it being exposure to the black light and the Otto's psychedelic worms that we get these shadows can be seen around Pin and Tulip in photographs, and it does work on a very just a tonal, thematic, no explanation needed kind of way.
Yeah, I think it is nice, in both those cases that that the resolution to those antagonist stories is kind of internal, that like they end up confronting their own demons or trying to confront their own demons and either winning or losing. And in the case of Hogfather, that's the mother figure that kind of comes back to haunt the brothers, and in Pin's case it's all his previous victims, I guess, that he ends up being exposed to through the blacklight. So yeah, the way he treats those characters I find quite interesting. It sort of makes them more well-rounded, but without compromising them in a way, because Pin never learns his lesson. Like we sort of
We don't.
we don't empathize with him as such, but we understand what that must be like to an extent, and it's quite terrifying, and we become quite invested in it. Quite certainly, we become invested in finding out what's going to happen.
I wonder to some extent, do we let Tulip off, or does Terry let Tulip off a bit easier than he should have? Um, it seems by everything I've read, Tulip is just as menacing as Penn, just not so intent. It's kind of like a second nature, and therefore it's not as bad, and it's not a logic I particularly care for. Consequences be consequences.
Yeah, I think that's fair, but at the end of the day, Tulip also gets reincarnated as a bug. Like he gets reincarnated as a woodworm, but the kind of bittersweet side of that is that he's so simple-minded that he doesn't care. He likes it. It's like, this is fucking good wood. That's his last line in the book, I think. Um, so yeah, I see where you're coming from. But it's not like he gets off scot-free either. He still gets downgraded quite significantly on in the reincarnation stakes. you know. Slant law offices attacked. Fire at Times offices. 2 thugs dead as waffles recovered by Times. Veterinary framed by imposter. Times can exclusively reveal. No mention of Lord de Worde whatsoever. Beer barrel bonanza. Brewery cart overturns on Elm Street. Oh, such terrible writing. Overuse of the word offices. Overuse of the word Times. Just dreadful stuff. I wouldn't get a job at any newspaper. The
I think
newspapers
we
still
need
give people jobs.
some decent copy before the deadline hit. Let's
Perhaps.
talk about Mr. Slant. We've seen him in a few books before, if I'm not mistaken.
Indeed, yeah. I was tempted to bring him up a couple of times, but this set piece at the office, at the law, at his offices, I think is the right time to kind of bring him up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it says a lot about obviously what Terry thinks about lawyers. That this is the only lawyer we ever really see is this zombie, and he's like not a particularly nice zombie as zombies go. So yeah, his kind of quite a menacing presence actually the whole way through the book. That kind of comes to a head at the start of this final act. What do we think about him? Like, do you like when you've got Mr. Pin and Mr. Tulip up against Slant? Who do you want to win?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think he's a fairly interesting sort of character type. Um, I think what's done with him in this book, the journey that he goes on from being one of the conspirators and one of the sort of anti-veterinary naysayers throughout the last couple of books. Um, Essentially, he's one of the masterminds behind. Um, Sorry, completely forgot what I was going to say there.
No, all good. I think it's a fair point. You know that he's this presence that is like hidden behind this very thin veneer of neutrality because he's an officer of the law or whatever, and he just serves his clients. It's obviously just a coincidence that all his clients are conniving bastards who are trying to overthrow the patrician. um,
I thought it was very interesting that that journey that um where his character ends up in terms of William de Worde co-opting him to act as his defense and to make sure that he walks away intact, that certain facts about the conspiracy aren't revealed. Slant is completely in a bind regarding where William has him.
yeah,
I thought that was just delicious in how that played out.
yeah, it's good to see him kind of have to take a stance because he wants to be removed. He wants this kind of plausible deniability the whole way through. It's clear that he wouldn't serve Lord de Worde and he wouldn't serve these people if he didn't think that their interests aligned with his, regardless of what he would say publicly. So when he's kind of forced to do the opposite and actually defend William, that's great. Yeah, it's a great arc for him. I think Terry's trying to say something in here that like that this is kind of the important role of journalism. That if William hadn't have investigated the matter and if he hadn't have published his findings, none of that would have been possible. So that I mean, it's just very basic kind of stuff about how the free press is supposed to hold power to account, etc., etc. And Slant kind of embodies that to an extent. But the fact that the the new firm turn on him at this point in the book is also, I think, it's actually, if anything, more interesting in terms of the social commentary, where that like where where do you draw that line between high class criminals essentially like Slant and then street level criminals like Tulip and Pin, and the kind of interaction between those two worlds. Like that's the stuff of great crime drama and great political thrillers. And again, it brings us back to Watergate and all that stuff that he's referencing.
Yeah, absolutely. Hmm.
And then so I was gonna say just before I read it actually that yeah, I only had four sections, but then I was like, this comes in at just under 400 pages by my count on the iPad version. Like, does this is a step back down from the Fifth Elephant in terms of page count?
Not by very much. I think it's
Okay.
approximately the same.
It certainly felt pacier to me. Like, there's not as much politics, I guess. There's not as much having to establish a whole new country, maybe, and things like that. We're back in Ankh-Morpork, we're back on familiar territory, and it just sort of felt that we kind of hit the ground running. So I sort of felt natural for me to break it up into 100-page chunks, give or take, for the synopsis. So hopefully that worked well for you guys listening at home. But we're really kind of in the finale sequence. By the time the new firm have dealt with Slant, then they're off for a reckoning with William at the Times. Saccharissa has stumbled in on their plot.
I thought the tulip and pin thing in terms of story structure was quite interesting because they essentially they go to slant job not complete, openly job not complete,
Hmm.
and it has a huge level of anti-climax. It doesn't feel like anti-climax at all. It just works for what it is. And I guess that is another sort of hark back to that sort of you said CSI Ankh-Morpork. I'm going to say ITV Ankh-Morpork.
Totally fair. Yeah.
Under that gritty 1970s crime drama where there's crossing and double crossing and things
Yeah.
fall apart.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
And
Yeah, and I think Penn kind of elaborates on this a little bit. You know, we get a bit of his POV throughout the book, and he's kind of like the only way out of this is like you can't leave a job. You can't just turn around and leave a job because you've got reputation to behold, but to uphold, sorry. But if your employer has messed you around, if they've kind of done you over, then if you want to uphold your reputation, you have to go and do them over. You know, you can't let that stand. So he manages to convince himself that Slant has pulled the fast one. So then within his code of honor, that allows him to go and do over Slant instead of finishing the job, as
got
you
to
say.
maintain your reputation, right?
Yeah,
Otherwise,
exactly. So that's good. And it means we get to see Slant sweat, or perhaps not sweat, as the case may be, since he's a zombie, a little bit. And it
um,
sort of takes us racing into the finale where things get set on fire, fights
yeah,
happen.
this was quite the destruction of the Ankh-Morpork Times offices was quite concerning. Yeah. Because I was going to ask you, do we get to see these characters return, or like more part times, more of a thing? And I think the answer is probably yes in some capacity, but I guess just I guess just that we spent all the 400 odd pages in these offices in this set and for it all to burn to the ground. And we've also mentioned Press Gang on his show a few times.
Indeed.
Stephen Moffat's premiere TV work about children running a newspaper, and the finale of the very last episode, Press Gang sees the newsroom just collapse into flames, and it's quite traumatic's probably the wrong word.
That's interesting because that would have happened. That had already happened about 5 years before this book came out, I guess, give or take. The finale of Press Gang.
Yeah.
Maybe even longer. I mean, it would have happened, and yeah, be surprised if Terry wasn't aware of it. Um, all the same, yeah, I think it's totally fair because like everything we know about these situations as they've happened in the Discworld before, there's always a reset at the end. Like the moving pictures no longer exist. Moving pictures, Hollywood comes to town, comes to the disc for a book, but at the end of the book, it's gone. Rock music comes in exactly the same way. We have a book's worth of story about rock music at the end of the book. Rock music no longer exists in the disc world.
I'll get
So,
to mention here, does not music with rocks in.
indeed. So Terry's possibly setting us up to think that the same thing is going to happen. You know, the press is going to burn down, the offices are gone. At the end of this book, yes, we're going to have a book's worth of story about newspapers. At the end of this book, maybe the newspaper is going to be gone. So I think that's really good way of kind of leveraging the previous work to kind of increase the stakes. And he's obviously conscious of this because he's referenced those other books explicitly in the text a couple of times. So when that turns out not to be the case, I think that's a really clear statement of intent from him that nope, the disc world is changing. New technology is going to come along and it's going to stay in a way that it hasn't perhaps previously. We've had a couple of books now where the Clacks exists. By the end of this book, the printing press, the Times is all re-established. They're going to keep going. That much is clear. So the disc world's definitely changing, and that status quo's going to remain. We're not having a reset here the way we've had previously. And I think It's quite interesting that we're talking a lot more about that kind of stuff, or maybe I am just because it interests me. But like I don't think it's ever in doubt that veterinary is going to make it back into office.
Yeah.
Like we're not super concerned about that. As I mentioned earlier, I think the real stakes are whether the Times is going to continue as a going concern, like and whether Lord de Worde is going to get caught. Those are the things that in this section that I feel are kind of the main stakes. Like we're not really worried that veterinary is actually going to be deposed, are we? Are you? Your first reading, are you worried about that?
I wondered because in terms of structure, it's played right to the end. I think veterinary just returns to office in like the last scene or the last um half dozen or last dozen pages.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
Yes, after all the action is ended, Scrope is still the patrician, which was is kind of a bit weird. But yeah, it is the other two.
But I think that almost serves to reinforce my point because it's almost like a coda where you're like, well, obviously that's going to happen. It's like a veterinary still around. There's zero chance of him being anything other than the patrician. So yeah, it does sort of feel a bit inevitable to me. Whereas, yeah, this idea that like we've become invested in William and Saccharissa and Otto and Good Mountain and Barony, their relationship, which is quite sweet. But that all might be gone. That it might all literally burn to the ground and not recover. Like that feels like the real kind of stakes, certainly of this last act.
Um, yeah, I wondered if it wasn't a little bit flimsy that we get the Times just keeps running because they resolved to steal or to raid the offices of the Inquirer to put out another edition. Um,
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I totally know what you mean. I think it's good in some ways to involve the Inquirer in the main storyline, though. It's been kind of this slight, those two stories of William trying to uncover the plot versus whether the Times is going to stay in business. Those are kind of two, and those are like an A and B story running parallel. And then they kind of intersect here. And even though it doesn't, you're right, it doesn't make a ton of sense. But the fact that both stories are established and then they cross, like that is the sort of thing that you can, I think, get away with. Certainly on the first blush, like as you're reading it, you're caught up at the moment. You're like, yep, that's fine. Saccharissa, I think, has an established connection with the Guild of Engravers who own the Inquirer through her father. So you sort of go, yeah, kind of get, maybe they let her away with it in the moment. And then obviously Slant comes along after the fact to kind of mop up everything from a legal point of view. So I totally agree that it's edgy for sure. um, in terms of getting our main characters out of their all is lost sort of moment. But also you get to see Saccharissa wave a crossbow around and be a badass, which is
yes,
awesome. So
badass moment was particularly joyful.
which I think maybe it's a stretch, but might also be a Pulp Fiction reference.
Yeah, quite a few. I noticed a Reservoir Dogs reference in there somewhere. Quite a few modern mentions.
Yeah, he's been on a bit of a Tarantino kick, obviously, while writing this, which is interesting. So it dates it a little bit, maybe, puts it very much in that kind of mid to late 90s time frame, but I don't know. It's a time frame that I'm fond of, so there's no complaints on this end for sure. One thing that I maybe would be more critical of on this reading than I would have been in previous readings is that William decides to let his dad off the hook.
Yeah, this is a bit of nepotism. It surprised me, but also kind of sat well with me as a kind of a thing that happens.
Yes, feels quite realistic in that sense. I sort of feel, I don't know if it's just a sign of the times where, like, you know, racism has just got so much worse. It's so much more prevalent in every facet of our society now than it was in 1999. I think, as a privileged white person, I sort of feel that, like, we've backslid. Society has backslid to a degree. Certainly, post 9/11, post 2008, fascists and racists feel much more emboldened now than they did then. I feel maybe that's not realistically the case, but, like, certainly the perception. I think the broad cultural perception is that fascism and racism is having an upswing at the moment. So the it feels soft for William to let his dad off for essentially trying to conduct a fascist coup. Like, he wanted to take power in the city to deal with minorities, to expel them, or to do whatever with them. Like, that's there's no other way to describe
I'm
that.
sure he rationalizes it to us in terms of like family, I guess. But I wonder, is there another level to this in terms of that sort of excusing? The people in the press excuse that behavior. If you think back to 2011, when Nick Griffin, the leader of the fascist British Nationalist Party, was being courted by the then quite legitimate Question Time on BBC.
Mm,
Um, and that, to me, in terms of media, opened the doorway to other right-wing British figures like Nigel Farage, Tommy Robinson,
yeah,
Jim Dowson, who would be given the legitimacy of a critical news and interviews vehicle,
yeah,
and beyond that to where they're
yeah,
now mainstream.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's fair to say, at least, that this book predates all that stuff, and I would sort of probably put 9/11 as year zero for that, and 2008 as a massive accelerator on it. But it does seem a little bit naive in retrospect, where you're like, yes, if you just kind of rap a fascist on the knuckles and tell him to fuck off, that he will fuck off. He won't. They'll always come back, as you point out. Nick Griffin evolved into Nigel Farage, and he split into Boris Johnson and all this. Like, that issue didn't go away with the Stern telling off. It got worse, right? To the point where, as you say, it's been mainstream, where they're on the brink of power, where they're in power in other countries. So yeah, that's the only element of the story, I think, that feels a little bit soft, a little bit dated, perhaps a little bit naive. Where Terry's usually such a canny observer of society and of the human condition. So I think, in that instance, we as a society let Terry Pratchett down. We fucked up. We made it worse than he thought it could be. Well done, everybody.
Oh dear.
Yeah, fucked up.
Worked up.
We ruined it. So yeah, bad times. Not a great way. There must be a more uplifting way to end the discussion than that.
Do you know, I might have mentioned earlier that I was kind of scrambling to get to this podcast on time with my reading, and I woke up this morning with 10 pages still to go. And so I think yesterday must have been like 60 pages.
It's impressive.
The last thing I remember going to sleep last night, um, it was at the part of the book where William and Saccharissa, or William's staring at the printing press, and he says, right, no more, we're not feeding it. He takes her by the hand. We're having the afternoon off. And I think that was the bit where my brain just got so tired, and went to sleep. You know, I'm not reading any more stuff.
To, to,
I've had it for now. And then I woke up today, I read the final 10 pages, and it's where we have the crash in the street where the beer barrels come undone. And of course, William immediately gets his notebook out. He's sending around for messengers, and the press just must be fed.
Indeed, indeed, yeah, and I think that ending just really underscores that, like the press, William Saccharissa, the Times, that's all here to stay. You know, this is a new normal in Discworld. Discworld now has a free press. It's got newspapers. You know, and yeah, well, William as a character, he's been on quite a journey through this. You know, even though we're critical of how he dealt perhaps with his father, you know, he's learned quite a lot. He's confronted his own privilege through, you know, hiring Otto, hiring Saccharissa, dealing with this whole conspiracy. And yeah, I mean, it's a satisfying conclusion, generally speaking. Despite the criticisms I just had, I think overall, I'm happy with kind of how this book ends. It feels really different, as I mentioned, to how moving pictures and how soul music ends in a good way.
I noticed for bright spots you've written the whole novel.
I didn't write that. That's a leftover from previous
All
notes, I
right.
think. But I mean, it stands. Totally stands. It
Yeah.
total banger. Um, do you want to go first?
Yeah,
Then
I've got three, so let's see what we can do. The first one is a long footnote, so I think I will just let's see. I'll just read it out and see what happens.
go on.
Most dwarfs were still referred to as he as well, even when they were getting married. It was generally assumed that somewhere under all that chainmail, one of them was female, and that both of them knew which one this was. But the whole subject of sex was one that traditionally minded dwarfs did not discuss, perhaps out of modesty, possibly because it didn't interest them very much, and certainly because they took the view that what two dwarfs decided to do together was entirely their own business. Um, yeah, that was just one of those sort of fuck yes moments allowed.
Indeed. Yeah. I think, you know, in terms of that whole, you know, issues of gender in society, like Terry really, well, I was going to say stumbled onto something. I don't think he stumbled onto it at all. I think he really clearly articulated like the kindest kind of view on those issues, and that's and to put it in, as I mentioned at the very start, you know, to put it into these characters who are advancing the technology, who are literally dragging this world forward, is obviously important. You know, he sees a place, a really important place for these characters in his world. I think that says something. You know, all mine are bleaker as always. I just noticed, just looking through my highlights, I noticed that I literally highlighted the phrase "useful idiot," which apparently occurs on page 201 when, yeah, when the committee to unelected patrician, that they're talking about Scrope. That's the words they use about him. It's a word that we hear a lot in politics now, you know, referring to the likes of Donald Trump and so forth, that like these people are being controlled or at least influenced wittingly or unwittingly by greater powers who have an agenda. We see that play out in this book. It's depressingly prescient, as much of this world is. Um, Other highlights, shout out to Harga's House of Ribs on page 215.
Oh yeah.
With some timey-wimey shenanigans, we have to wonder if death is perhaps behind the grill. This is, yeah, this is in reference to the elves stole my husband story, which William has fact-checked. And it turns out that the subject is a lady called Flo who used to work as a waitress in Harga's House of Ribs.
Yes. I believe it was Flo that we met back in Mort.
Oh, indeed. Uh, Good catch. Yeah, one thing we didn't actually talk about at all are these kind of Greek chorus moments where the tenants are reading the newspaper.
Yeah,
Annoying.
these
Yeah,
are
and what the general public what their perception of the people who make the news, like, oh, they wouldn't let them write just anything, all that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
is social commentary that I don't feel in any way qualified to kind of comment on. But
It kind of
Terry,
finds a little microcosm of an audience here, sort of does.
yeah, totally, totally. And then actually on that, that leads me quite nicely into what I probably will pick as my quote.
Well, I've picked that too. But if we go chronologically, there's a scene that which I think you'll also agree is quite a standout, um, which is Tulip and Death.
Oh yeah,
Um,
the potato.
Potato. So I've picked just a little bit out of that. Uh, is this the bit where my whole life passes in front of my eyes? He said. No, that was the bit just now. Which bit? The bit, said Death. Between your being born and your dying. Know this, Mr. Tulip. This is your whole life as it passed before other people's eyes.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, just that, like, that slight tweak of perspective, taking something through to its logical conclusion. It's just that's vintage Pratchett.
I think you were about to mention page 421 in my edition, which is William's meltdown with Windling.
It's not, no, sorry, yeah,
No.
because my page numbers are askew as a result of reading on Kindle. But the kind of discussion about the press and the paper and what it means to have a free press that kind of occurs between William and the patrician just a bit before that.
Oh, I don't
Uh,
read
just
sing.
again, just leads me to one of Terry's really succinct observations of human nature, which is this is veterinary to William. Do you mean that the public is a different thing from the people you just see walking about the place? The public thinks big, sensible, measured thoughts, while people run around doing silly things.
Hmm.
And it's a thought that he's articulated elsewhere, which is basically, people are smart, but crowds are stupid.
Yeah.
And actually, in a weird way, the patrician is actually accusing William of thinking the reverse of that, which is that the public, as a whole, are smart, but people individually are silly. And I think that's the patrician is challenging that notion, and he's obviously the smartest person in the room. So I think we're expected to kind of go along with that challenge, certainly based on, I'd say, other observations that he's made about human nature in the past. But those are the things, said it before, said it again. Those are the things that consistently bring me back to Discworld. Just that, like, absolutely crystal clear observations of human nature
There's quite
wrapped
a
up.
wealth of really good scenes towards the end. I'm wondering actually, is it more that they're the ones I remember because they're finales and they're most recent in my memory. And this is definitely a book that I will look forward to going back on. I had William's meltdown with Windling, and I'm going to read a bit of that out.
Yeah,
Um, Well, I wrote the article in the Times, he snapped. And what's in there is what I say, me, because I found things out and checked things. And people who say ing a lot tried to kill me. I'm not the man that's a brother of some man you met in the pub. I'm not some stupid rumor put about to make trouble. So just remember that before you try any of that everyone knows stuff. And in an hour or so, I've got to go up to the palace and see Commander Vimes and whoever is in it, the patrician, and a lot of other people to get this whole thing sorted out. And it's not going to be very nice, but I'm going to have to do it because I wanted you to know things that are important. Sorry about the teapot, Mrs. Arcanum. I'm sure it
yeah,
can't be mended.
yeah. I mean, it's great that you're dying for him to have that outburst in every one of those scenes, and obviously he's not going to do it till the end, and it's extremely satisfying when it comes.
Yeah.
Uh, the only other thing, I'm just looking through my notes, the only other note that I have in my highlights that I didn't address just says Mr. O'Biscuit. So, yeah, it's apparently a reference to the university that we encountered in the Lost Continent. We've got a wizard from the student paper from 4X who's come to be in the Times. Why is he called Mr. O'Biscuit? I don't. Is it a reference to something? I don't know. It's a name that kind of stuck with me, maybe because it's slightly Irish coded or something. But I'm intrigued by it.
I've no idea, no
It's
experience.
no, I don't think he ever comes up. I don't think I ever recall reading
I'll
about
just
him
go
ever
to the
again.
space annotations for that one.
Yeah, so I don't know. It just tickled me. Oh, yeah, that's making me a bit peckish actually. Um, but that's it then. There we go. It's
Yeah,
another.
thank you very much for sticking with us. It's been, yes, it's been a full story.
There's got to be a newspaper analogy to be made there. It's the end of the late edition. It's tomorrow's fish and chips wrapper. It's something.
Yeah, oh, I love those quotes at the end as well about it just being so today's stories.
Just has to be true for
We're
today.
lucky,
Yeah.
we're lucky this week's stories. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in the current context, it almost the whole thing reads as a bit of a love letter and a bit of a requiem almost for newspapers. Newspapers, although they still exist, they're certainly not what they were
Yeah.
in terms of leading the cultural conversation in the way that they were in 1999.
You should all be buying Private Eye.
Yeah, absolutely should privatize. Fantastic.
I'd like to say a big thank you to our friends Ben and Elizabeth at the Pratt Chat podcast, who are always giving us a shout out, as well as other folks on Blue Sky and Facebook who do the same. Thanks for that. My top patrons, Arslan Hyder Ali, and Ian Lawther, who goes half on the Zoom bill for this. Thanks to the people who have been supporting us on Blue Sky or Facebook or whatever, and just like mentioning the podcast and talking about it and talking to us. I'm all for a bit of conversation on there. You can find us at Discord GNU on Blue Sky, Facebook, YouTube. Um, And do check out our other stuff. Anything you would like to plug, PJ?
Nothing that I haven't plugged before. If you've listened to the show, I've had nothing new come out. Absolutely watch Country Rogues, listen to The Devil's Own. If you haven't already, I'm not going to make a big sales pitch for either of them anymore.
Find a bunch of links below wherever this podcast is hosted. Uh,
Indeed.
Country Rogues on BBC iPlayer, The Devil's Own on BBC Sounds, Coastlines After Dark on bookstoread.com/. Coastlines After Dark, Another Time novel, Help, VR film on YouTube.
Oh
The
yeah.
Doctor Who Dumpster Floor has just ended, which is a wonderful comedy sketch show, I guess, stand-up comic routine mix mash quite thing. And coming back soon, next couple of months, are the Press Gang Readers commentaries.
Woohoo.
And when we go off air, I will be disclosing a few details about some very special guests for those that I can't announce just yet.
Ooh. I would be interested to know what people who didn't have our experience. If you're a young person now reading this book who doesn't really have the same experience, cultural experience of the printed word, certainly of the daily newspaper as a cultural institution, would be interested to know what people make of it. But there are plenty more exciting things to come. Have you had a sneak peek at the next book? Obviously not. You just finished reading this book this morning, so
I'm completely in the dark about what comes next. So
I have 2 words or one hyphenated word, depending on that I think will make you excited. Timey, wimey.
ooh, anticipation.
I'll leave it at that. All right, yeah. So join us next month when we'll be. Oh well, I'll be on holiday. Hopefully next month, at some stage next month, maybe later in the month than usual, depending on how things go. But do join us for a discussion about book 26, Thief of Time.
Are we? Let's see you then.
Hold the front page. No wait, what did I say?
Front page.
Bye bye.